This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmorepodcasts.com.
On today's episode, we discuss the expectations of the game state and the story told through optimization. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop scenarios and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John. And I'm Ian.
It's always a great little pause whenever we get to John. It's like the sound delay hits him, and then he announces his presence. So I'm going to start things off with a shower thought of a very, very quick preface. I have been studying Call of Cthulhu, and specifically not just the legacy of Call of Cthulhu, like it's in its 7th edition, but specifically 7th edition, the newest edition to come out. Featured a little, like, briefly from Critical Role. I was inspired to go check out Call of Cthulhu, Shadow of the Crystal Palace, which is just it's an interesting setup because, one, you of course, actors playing this game, so automatically there's going to be a deeper sense of role playing. But going in, looking at Call of Cthulhu, I have players who play COC, and they really enjoy it. And those are the same players that are in the Shadowfell. And those two players tend to really dive deep into the lore, the story, the overarching elements. And they also plant those seeds of chaos and then let it play out. And I wonder now, that may also just be their personalities, but also Call of Cthulhu is something that lends itself very well to planting seeds of chaos, seeing what happens, and this deep, dark narrative. Now, my thought has to do with setting up the expectations for the type of game you're in. And D&D does a pretty good job, even just within its own legacy, the mainstream idea, just the feeling of D&D. You get the sense that you are heroes and you are fighting villains and there's this grand story. Now, this is explicitly stated in the player's handbook of what kind of game this is. And then with Call of Cthulhu, it is also stated exactly what kind of game this is. There's a section that just says, tips for the players. And one of the first things you see is making multiple investigators. Because you're a squishy human in a cosmic horror setting. And it says, you might have the expectation that you could meet a grisly, gruesome end quickly. And your story might end, before the grand story closes. So it might be a good idea to think about another investigator. If yours went away, what happens and how do you get another one? And it puts it like right there in the rules that there's a high chance that you could just meet your end. And in the entire framework of how the rules are written and how the investigator's handbook, the player's handbook in this case, is presented, it really paints the picture of you might spend a lot of time making your character and they could meet a gruesome, quick end. And in a way, it's the risk that you go into it with this. In Eldritch Horror especially, you don't know a lot. You're dealing with cosmic entities that are beyond our understanding. That's the whole thing behind the Lovecraftian lore. And a lot of people buy into that. And they know up front that things could go absolutely terribly wrong, and they're here for it. And that's the sort of framework that you exist in Call of Cthulhu. You know that something awful could happen to your character. You could lose your mind. You could literally go insane. You could see terrible images. You could be haunted. You could be possessed. You'd be slowly corrupted over time. And it's those strange afflictions that sort of drive forward the expectations of the player. And if you buy into that, going in, oh, I might just die. And won't that be fun? And it's so interesting to think about the shift in mentality. And then I'll see those same players in D&D, something awful might happen with their character or something very risky, and they go, yeah, I'm here for it. And it's like they're absolutely fine. And what sort of expectation does that breed when you put it right up front that, and it's not just you might die, it's just like you might get twisted and mangled and changed, and you might, be affected by alien creatures, and you're there to see the corruption of your character and throughout the story. And there might be redemption in there or not. You're there for the weird and the twisted part of it all. And it's just such an interesting shift in mentality because they put it right out the front. This is not a heroic story. This is a gothic horror story. And not a gothic, cosmic horror story. This is not Strahd. This is Cthulhu. It's very different. And it also ties back to that depth of lore is where the warlock comes from. That's one of the main influences of the Great Old One. The Great Old One is Lovecraftian eldritch horror. And just knowing a little bit about that, like you want a giant tentacle monster to be your patron, okay, cool, but that's influenced from those forms of literature kind of meeting their way back toward Dungeons and Dragons. But I love the idea that they set up the expectations just in how the player's handbook is constructed, and even at the end of the book where it's like, hey, make sure you show up on time, make sure you cooperate and communicate with each other because secrets are important. Also, secrets can get you killed. Be careful about that. And if you die, here, make another character. This is how you do it. And it kind of prepares them for all the terrible things that could happen without robbing them of that investment. And I find that really interesting when we start diving into buying into the storytelling, the grand story, and also just role-playing. There's a ton of flaws and ideals and elements and like twisted parts that you tie into your backstory that can have mechanical benefits or detriments. And it's like you're almost rewarded in ways of making the most messed up person or making like a twisted macabre or a very dark mirror of yourself. And everybody's there for it because it's about the story, and the story is dark cosmic horror. So you have people that are unstable. You don't have the stalwart, plucky hero. That's not the norm. And when does that become a trope that everybody's got a dark backstory and twisted? But I love seeing that flip of the table, quite literally, into this other world of popular tabletop scenarios.
So I have a quick mechanics question because I am completely like alien, not to be funny, to Call of Cthulhu, right? I've heard anecdotal like story details, but I haven't ever heard like the mechanics. Yep. So are you mechanically rewarded when your character is corrupted? So like it's like, yeah, you might experience madness, but you also get like an additional power or something. Is that kind of what you're saying?
It seems like a narrative benefit that and I shouldn't even say it like that. It also depends on the keeper, the GM, of how they run things. So you might be seeing ghosts, and that is a detriment to your sanity, and you're encouraged to role play that and to really lean into that. However, by seeing ghosts, that might provide, I can talk to the dead person that died in this building, and I'm privy to information that others might not be. However, I'm also going slowly insane. So there's like a risk and reward that's coming from trying to tell a more interesting and deeper story, but then there are also detriments to it because you look crazy. But maybe you get information that is actually right.
Well, and to me, that is a mechanical benefit. You change the game state once you understand more information. In game design, this is the difference between what's called a perfect and an imperfect game, right? So a perfect game is when all players involved have all of the information available at all times. So an example of this would be like chess or checkers, right? Mm-hmm. There's never a point in chess or checkers where the only limitation is whatever you've been trained to, right? But theoretically, both players know how to castle. Both players know how pawns work, you know? Both players understand the objective of the game. So that's considered a perfect game because, like, you can't hide anything. If you have infinite foresight, right? You're able to understand based on each other's moves, like exactly how the game is going to turn out, which is why a lot of times chess grandmasters, it's like you don't get to checkmate because they understand, they can see like 15 turns ahead. Nope, they've already got me in checkmate already, you know? Whereas an imperfect game is where knowledge is hidden or information is hidden. So like Magic the Gathering is a good example of that. You don't know what card you're going to draw next. You don't know what cards are in your opponent's hand. You don't know, you know, your opponent's strategy or win condition, right? You're playing more probability and information gathering than you are necessarily trying to just outposition the other person. So in this way, I actually find that information is a game mechanic. And if you have the risk be like your sanity score, right? Which I'm guessing it's like a quantity. There's a quantity.
It's a
when
quantity,
it comes to
yeah.
sanity. Yeah. Like in order to get more information, yeah, it might be more story driven and it might be more, the purpose is immersion, but it's still a game. It's a systemized mechanic that impacts the narrative, hitting that ludonarrative harmony, you know?
Yeah. And I've seen narratives where people, like, they start to lose that sanity. And they might have, like, they even have a checkbox in the character sheet that says, like, temporarily insane or indefinitely insane. And it's been like a character's arc to fight their way out of madness and to discover what the source of their madness was. Oh, I had this weird, like, parasitic thing that was a sentient being from this other plane that was attached to me. And then by ridding the world of that, oh, your sanity has returned. And, like, all your memories are back. And, like, what? And then they have to also deal with that, you know, whiplash. They played an insane investigator. Now they're not insane anymore. But that, like, those are mechanical elements. Then there are immersion elements, and they're all woven together very, very well. This is also a game where low numbers are helpful. A lot of things are done with a percentile die, and you need to roll below whatever your score is. So you start with a certain score, and there's a lot of, like, multipliers and whatnot when you make your character. It's weird to have a strength of 75, but that means if I roll a 74 or lower, I'm successful in whatever my thing was that I was trying to do. But say my score gets dropped in some way, now my range of success continues to shrink. And that's kind of where it all flows. They're all on scales of 100, basically. And then there are ways you can push and mess with luck for that.
So the other thing that this kind of brings up, because it's interesting that you said this kind of excites players that are looking for their character to be corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, D&D already also has this kind of game style in its adventure Descent into Avernus, which is like one of the key questions that the designers ask is, can you get through this adventure and still be a good person? Because the environment rewards you for allowing corruption into you, right? So even piloting one of the infernal war machines requires sacrificing a soul to power the machine. So if you're a cleric or a paladin and you're like lawful good, that might really like tear at you, even though, you know, you could probably weasel your way out of the moral question of, well, what was the soul doing here? They must have been an evil soul to end up here. So, you know, it's one of those things. So I would be interested in, like, for me, I would want to play this game and challenge myself by trying to be a good person.
Yeah.
And even though it's a dark world, can I rise above it? Or is there going to be a point where I literally can't progress in the game without compromising the morality of the character I'm trying to play? You know, like, to me, that's like almost playing the game on hard mode because it's rewarding you for accepting that corruption. And you even though there is a risk, you're judging the risk, right? Like choosing not to be corrupted, if you even have that choice, because I'm assuming there's a lot of randomness involved in determining how much madness you actually take in or whatever, along with some choice. Again, I'm completely unfamiliar with the system, but like, for example, do I risk like relinquishing my mechanical benefits to keep my morality, even though I'm losing out on information and stuff. And is there a way I can actually play through the game like that? You know,
Right.
but I do think there are two types of players when it comes to creating their character, and there's more than two, but like I'm setting up these two examples, which is players that like discovering their character through play and through happenstance, and players that like to intentionally create the story because they want to really dive deep in. This sounds like a system that rewards the former and discourages the latter because your investigator can die at any moment. But as a player, I'm really more of the latter, you know, like when I have a character, I plan a beginning, middle, and end. And then I have, you know, room for the circumstances to change that or to color those perceptions. But, you know, if I know that my character is going to they can die right away, I'm not going to invest that up front, you know, in the same way that I might necessarily in, say, like a D&D scenario, you know?
I know that they can't like die instantly unless the dire straits are very, very terrible. Like I've watched a segment where they're like running away from a very, very dangerous space, and there are these instances where someone nearly gets pulled into the floor and they make this check and then they failed it, and then someone reached out and grabbed them, so they pulled them out, and in so doing that they took damage. But your hit points are very low, and they don't increase the same way that a D&D characters would. So it isn't like, okay, one fail, you're dead. It's if I fail enough times, if I fail 3 times, I could suffer enough damage that I'm just gone. And and regardless of how much of a veteran investigator, I might have better skills now. And progression isn't based on like, I'm a diver, I progress in my diving skills. It's, I was a diver, I'm now an investigator, and I'll gain segments that time. But it's the same thing with like the Deadlands model, that a wound is a wound. You're not a mountain of hit points. You suffer 3 wounds, ow, you suffer the 4th, you're unconscious, and you're probably going to die. It's just there's a sense of you're always squishy. You're always human. And there might be other ways to fix that, not fix it, but I mean, adjust that scale. But this is a thing that rewards lore. It rewards knowledge, and knowledge is definitively currency. And that your character can still have an arc and a story. However, I think that you're right. The chances of that arc stopping are much higher, just because of the circumstances of the cosmic horror.
Right. I'm saying you can't, your ability, anytime in a game system, randomness is a more influential factor that is going to diminish your ability to intentionally plan something out. And that's not a bad thing either. But like you said, there are certain players that style is going to attract, which by definition means there are certain kinds of players that style is going to kind of repel, right? And for me, like I would be interested in playing it just to kind of see how I would match up against it.
Maybe a one shot.
There are certain like styles that I'm like Pathfinder repelled me. I tried it. I was like, there's a lot of numbers that I never end up using. And it took me 2 hours to make a character, and I only used like 3 of the numbers I wrote down. So why?
Right.
So yeah, I know Ian had something to say.
Yeah, I was actually going to go back to what you were initially talking about, where you have players who are making multiple characters in advance of this session or this campaign. And I thought that was interesting because it implies that the player characters are more, I guess you could say, normal or average than in D&D, where even though both character types have the same stats, not the same stats, but you know, you're strong in some areas or weak in other areas. I would argue that in Call of Cthulhu, it sounds more like you're playing a normal person in this cosmic horror, a person who just happens to have survived and is going through all of these experiences, and whether or not they die is really up in the air, depending on what they encounter.
I don't want to misrepresent the theming of the game. It is the idea that investigators are exceptional people, but they come from all walks of life. So your occupation that grants you your trained skills. If you want to target it like that, that's your starting point. But then there's no capstone to your occupation. It's not a class. After that point, you're just a dude, and you're a person now navigating these places. It puts a lot more onus on less about level progression and a lot more about role-playing progression.
Yeah, no, I got you there. I just thought it was interesting because by creating just the simple act of creating multiple characters and preparing to die or something in Call of Cthulhu, it makes it so that there's a precariousness in how you create these characters. You kind of need to make them really quickly, presumably, because I know that when I started making D&D characters, it took me like 2 hours or something to figure it out. Plus, I was trying to understand some backstory questions and how I wanted to write it, because I love to creatively write my backstories. But with these, it sounds like you're a lot less invested until they survive longer. And that's a style of play that you can also see in D&D. There are a lot of people who like dungeon crawling, for example, or Dungeon of the Mad Mage, or Tomb of Annihilation, where you prepare multiple characters just in case something goes wrong, and you don't want to take, a few hours to roll up another character. But what I was getting at is that in D&D, the DM, I feel, at least I feel that these days we as DMs are leaning more towards, although terrible things can happen to your character, we'd prefer it if they not die, because we are enjoying the story so far that we're creating, or the story that we planned out. So if a character dies and you've written this whole backstory, it can feel a lot less rewarding in Dungeons and Dragons. But in Call of Cthulhu, you don't have to worry about that, because you haven't made a whole backstory. You maybe have a couple of traits, but you're exploring them as it... I mean, I'm not saying you don't. I'm sure plenty of people do that, but I feel like there's less incentive to create a whole unifying backstory for what's going on, at least based on how it sounds.
So I'm not quite... Yeah, the next breadth in that is I'm surprised by that pre-framing, because there's a whole chunk in character creation that's make yourself a background, make out all your flaws and your traits and your good, like all your different traits, and really think deeply about who this person is and how they behave. And it isn't like, okay, session 1, 5 minutes in, you're dead. But it's because the majority of your stuff is, as even combat is like, there's not really an initiative count. It's narrative. It's all spoken, and a lot of it is theater of the mind. It uses props for things, for different immersions that you're supposed to like physically interact with while you're playing. And if you're not interacting with them, you're not using them. It's a very theater, not even just theater of the mind, because you have some theater in it. There's a lot of preparing your acting chops to then play this character. So there's definitely time that you spend building up the background of this creature. They're not just some flunky. You're supposed to think deeply about who they are, and do all that work, and then pre-frame the players to say, and they might die.
I guess, is this a more accurate way to put it? You're playing less who the character is, and you're more excited about the changes that will happen to them, right?
Yes.
So it's for players that are invested in the process of playing and change, rather than delving deep into who they already are. Because that's another way to put it, like when I'm playing Solomon and Grey Owls, like, of course there are things that are going to change. In the finale, his emotional dampening was taken away from him. So he had to deal with this new thing, and that's going to lead to further role-playing stuff. But, I think what Ian's trying to say is you're not invested in who the character already is, because you know they're going to change. So even though you ask yourself, who is my character? What is their backstory? How does that influence their behavior? All the usual stuff. If you invest yourself in who they are already, you're going to be unable to role play out the changes that are going to happen over the course of play. So it's kind of understanding a little bit of both. Whereas, Dungeons and Dragons, there are times characters don't really change, So it's like, I'm playing the barbarian. He's loud and boisterous. And by the end of the campaign, I'm still a barbarian that's loud and boisterous, but I made friends along the way, versus I'm starting out as like a barbarian that's loud and boisterous. And then my sanity was robbed from me and I have tentacles sticking out of my neck. And really, all of a sudden I'm in grief because I keep seeing the ghosts of all of the people I've killed and they haunt me constantly, those are two very different stories that you're now trying to tell. And 5th edition has been very upfront, even in their subclass design, that the game revolves around archetypes and tropes that people are familiar with, even with the lineage system. Like they're like, the wood elf in the player's handbook was never designed to encompass every single wood elf that you had in your head conceptually. This is the archetypal wood elf that from Tolkien lore, from common fantasy tropes, these are the kinds of abilities they have. You aren't meant to be locked into those to those rules. Those rules are supposed to convey a trope. And if your character is breaking the mold because that's what interests you, you should have the freedom to be able to change what makes sense.
Yeah, and that's pretty interesting because it's the same thing with backgrounds. In the player's handbook, I'm pretty sure before or after they present the archetypal backgrounds, they're like, you can also just come up with your own background and take 2 proficiencies, 2 languages, and a tool proficiency or something like that. And I thought that was pretty interesting because so many people just kind of ignore that. So because it's already pre-made, so why take the trouble of coming up with your own thing? But then it's just as much trouble to read through all of them, right? So what I was also getting at was that I, as a player, enjoy creating extensive backstories and actual fiction, not just details, but fiction for my characters. And I feel compelled to do that for each character I make. Therefore, I pretty much have a good grasp of who they are and how they behave in certain scenarios. Whereas in this one, it's more like I'm finding out more and more about them. And I think, and they're not mutually exclusive either. You could have the same scenario in either campaign and find out more about them, or find out what happens when in Call of Cthulhu, your character is resistant to that change or resistant to the things that they're experiencing somehow, randomly, like rolling 4 nat 20s in a row. Somehow it just happens. But yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at, is that in D&D, it feels more like you are playing the character, and there might be some changes, but you've invested so much already in coming up with how they are going to behave or how you expect them to behave, unless you as a player are prepared to accept the changes that follow depending on the scenarios you're put in.
Yeah.
And to bring it back to the point you originally made, Ian, I can see if the expectation right up front is your investigator might die and you should be prepared to make another one, I can see why you would make a functional backstory rather than an emotionally invested backstory, which is different. It's not that you're spending more or less time or it's more or less detailed, but like Solomon, this is for example, like Solomon's backstory, I was emotionally invested in seeing that through, seeing where from backstory to beginning to middle to end. For this like if I were to make an investigator in Call of Cthulhu, knowing my investigator would die, I would create backstory details that would be functional to the process of gameplay to inform me how they would act, but I would not be invested in seeing how that backstory manifests or emotionally investing to make it to watch it, to get to the end, because it's not about beginning, middle, end. It's about accepting the changes that would happen through the course of gameplay. Because again, the more randomness that you add to a system, right, the less sure that you are that you're going to be able to see it through, right? That's what randomness means. It means you might not, I'm actually going to insert my shower thought real quick here, just because I don't think we need to talk about it for too long. But, we just played Geras Session 5. And one of the things that came up was, I wanted to present the environment as an obstacle, right? I know Rime of the Frost Maiden just came out, and if I had bought and read that, I probably could have ran it more efficiently. But it was basically a desert adventure. You've got to cross the desert, The desert is not a nice place to cross. So one of the things I told the players to do was, this is the carry weight of everything you need to cross the desert without basically risking overheating and dying in the desert, And it was like 37 pounds of equipment. Now, the way I'm running variant encumbrance, meaning your max carry weight is 5 times your strength score. So if you have strength as a dump stat, which one of the players did, and your strength score is 8, you can carry 40 pounds. If 37 of those pounds is now dedicated to carrying your equipment, that gives you 3 pounds of like weapons and stuff, So, and this equipment included bedrolls and food and water and all that stuff. So one of my players was like, all right, carry weight is, how can I navigate or get around this carry weight problem? What if we hire a wagon with mules? And I'm like, great. That's a logical solution. And I told my players up front, if you get a wagon with mules, it will not get you there faster or slower. You will be a greater target for monsters in the desert than if you're carrying everything on your backpack. It's easier to be stealthy. And my players, I could see it in chat, were like, all right, what do we think the probability is going to be? They were trying to play out the statistics. Now, the deep, dark, dirty DM secret is, for me, I predetermined based on their choice what would happen. If they didn't do the wagon, if they took the penalty, no encounter. If they took the wagon, encounter. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened, right? So the idea was that for me, and I've experienced this as a DM and a player, if I make a decision knowing the risk and reward, randomness will sometimes reward behaviors that will make the outcome seem like it's not meaningful. All right. That wasn't a very graceful way to say it, but like the idea being like, let's say I had them not take the wagon and I rolled randomly. And even if there's only a 10% chance, let's say I make it and they have to fight an encounter. Now they'll be like, well, we might as well have brought the wagon. You open that door for it being like, well, the choice didn't end up mattering because we failed the roll or whatever. Oh, the opposite being true. If they took the wagon and nothing bad happened, it's like, well, let's take the wagon all the time. And it's, at what point do you start taking away from the story? It's this whole actions and consequence thing. Whereas now you have 2 very clear choices, Do we want to try to go for the extra encounter but not have to worry about carry weight? Or do we do carry weight and not worry about the encounter? And ultimately they chose the wagon and their mules got eaten right away. Like, because that's what the monster is used to finding. It goes mule, chomp. And then the players dealt it a bunch of damage. So it burrowed underground because it got hurt. So then I gave them the choice. Do you want to just retreat because, Ian's character Hunter's marked it. It's not going to chase after you. Do you want to try to run away? And they're like, yeah, we'll just run away. But then they lost all their food and water. So ultimately it ended not working in their favor because they tried to circumvent the recommended solution, which it may not have depending on how the fight went, depending on their choices during the fight, on the rules. But ultimately, that's what ended up happening. So the question I ask myself is, when does randomness start to reward or discourage certain behaviors you want to see? And when is it more appropriate to have kind of a fixed consequence based on a fixed, choice tree, So that was just my little 2 cents to this. Call of Cthulhu sounds like a more randomized system. Like you say, chaos to me means random. It's going to reward certain behaviors and discourage certain other ones. And it's going to attract certain players because of that and repel others, which isn't a bad thing because sometimes you want to attract certain players. You want a specific experience.
And that also saves us from any point where you have, the player that comes in and says, I've got this amazing backstory and it's going to come forward and be fulfilled in this way. And awesome, that's great. And then they get their face eaten by a tentacle monster and they go, this game's stupid. I don't get to have my cool thing. when everyone else at the table came in without that expectation, and they're like, dude, just make another one. Here comes my twin brother. I I will avenge him. He gets his legs eaten by a tentacle monster. This game's stupid. Flips table, leaves. I could see that people would get really invested in different ways, and then be disappointed if their story ended, or if their character got corrupted. We've had players, say stuff like, "Oh, well, I got cursed in this way, and therefore that was an antagonistic relationship with me, and I won't play anymore." When it's like, no, that happens in the game. Like, yeah, you can get corrupted in the game. That's part of the story. Look, it says right here in the book.
This just reminded me of a certain style of RPG that has been, well, actually, I guess it's kind of been prominent ever since the start of video games, really, which is just the type of RPG where you're playing a certain character, a certain class, and everything. You go in with the expectation that you might not make it to the end of the game, especially when it comes to video games. So recent examples include Barony, which is a kind of I think it's like a 32-bit game or something, one of those very classic kind of blocky styles. And you are expected as the player to make several runs of this game to try and get as far as possible. It's one of those dungeon crawls, bullet hells kind of things. It's very interesting because Call of Cthulhu kind of reminds me of that, except for D&D, where maybe you're not as invested in your character. Like you know what their backstory is, their character traits and stuff. Maybe you're just not as invested in the character development sometimes, but more into how far into the game can you get and how much can you learn in the game and about the world and the information. And maybe you do save the world, maybe you don't. But it's really interesting to me because that's a really addicting game style where it's such a hard game, not Call of Cthulhu, but like the style of game. It's such a hard game that you're expected to take a long time to learn how to play it right and how to maximize your survivability so you can make it that far into the game. And it's really interesting to me that that you mentioned that it's like, oh, suddenly your face gets eaten, take out your next character. Oh, unfortunately, that character went, indefinitely mad and you're just babbling in a corner. Take out your next character. And I think that kind of stuff is really interesting because it's promoting, instead of, it can promote character development and character growth and all that stuff, but it's also emphasizing a pillar of play that we don't often prioritize, which is exploration and understanding more about the world. And that can get a lot of players really excited, I've found.
So speaking a little bit on the story that people opt in to tell, and sometimes people have certain stories that they have tied into the major mechanics of the game. Ian, you had a shower thought that might tie in here if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. So lately, I've been thinking about the concept of min-maxing, which is a concept in D&D and other RPGs where you are minimizing. I've actually found a definition. It is minimizing desirable quality or undesirable qualities of a character so as to maximize the desirable qualities in order to achieve the most powerful character possible in an RPG, whatever RPG that is. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because in D&D, we try to promote a lot of variety in creating characters and telling stories in different ways, but also there is the mechanical part of it, which is combat usually, or skill checks at least. And for a lot of people, this, just the inherent fact that there are numbers to be manipulated, implies that there is an optimal route. And that's kind of how Pathfinder came up, I'm pretty sure, in the end, that there's so many feats, but in the end, there's only a few feats you really should have. And with D&D, we try to avoid that because we want people to play some interesting characters and we want people to have unique roles. And there's a lot of pros and cons to min-maxing because a lot of people think that min-maxing stops you from playing D&D as it was like designed to be played, which is as a role-playing game, as a storytelling game, or something like that. For those of you who can't see me, I'm doing little quotation marks. And I thought I would talk a little bit about that So I looked up a couple of hot takes on min-maxing and wrote down the pros and cons of it. One of the cons that a lot of people talk about is that min-maxing can actually break the game balance because of its specialization. Because you are maximizing certain qualities, you might shine really well in certain scenarios, but in other scenarios, you're just completely unequipped. So in games like Oblivion or other Elder Scrolls games, you have the option to min-max and focus on certain things. But if you're going into areas that these qualities are pretty much useless, for example, enchantment magic or something like that, the School of Magic, you're not going to be able to do anything in a combat with a bunch of Daedra hacking at you with your enchantment magic, because it's just kind of useless on people who aren't people. And another way is, for example, with the rogue. Rogue is technically always considered a specialist in D&D because they have sneak attack, they have expertises, and they have other things. But if you put that rogue in a scenario where it's not, for example, a scenario you can persuade your way out of, or there's no like locks to pick or something like that, then you are up a creek there. You're dependent on your other party members to be able to pull you out of this. And so that's actually one thing that I brought up with this. Is one of the pros of min-maxing is that everyone is unique and everybody has a strength and a moment to shine. But then you also have to consider whether or not some party members are sharing roles. Some of them, because we always talk about primary roles and secondary roles. Some characters are going to have the same secondary role, even if their primary roles are different. Or they may have the primary role the same, or the secondary role is different. So that means that if you've built a min-maxed character, you're going to be outshining the other person who is, supposed to fulfill that role as well. And that was one of the other cons in there. The third one is that it's supposed to discourage variety. I thought this was interesting because, like I said, specialization, you would think that all the players would have their own role and stuff. But what it means here is that there's supposed to be some sort of optimized character or something. Instead of choosing to play a wizard and then finding yourself being harried by melee combatants and stuff, there's obviously an optimal character for that, the tank, the barbarian, or something like that. So, and this is what drives people, this prospect of the imaginary in D&D optimal character that can handle whatever situation or all the most challenging situations. The fact that that is supposed to exist drives people to come up with builds and theory craft and really think about, this is where you're going to be covering most of your bases. And if you're in a scenario that, isn't going to work out for you, you should probably just leave that scenario. So it's just kind of funny how this optimization discourages variety, even though specialization as a team might encourage variety. So it's a little paradoxical in a way. And last but not least is that one of the biggest cons of min-maxing, according to the D&D community, is that it's supposed to discourage roleplay. Min-maxing is supposedly a reward for a lot of players who are more interested in the mechanical outputs of their characters, being optimized in combat, not really caring about the story, being killers, for example, as John has about before. And just they throw the story to the wayside because they're more interested in combat than anything else, or skill checks at least. And so I think that there's a lot to unpack on that comment, and it looked like John actually had an idea, so I thought I'd let him take over for a second.
No, go through the pros first.
Okay. I have 2 pros that I wrote down, but I think there's more that we can explore here. One pro, personally, that I think is that min-maxing actually provides a desirable expression of your character. If you want your mechanics to match your story, which they don't have to, but if you want to feel like your character is effective and it has a good story, not having a min-max character, not having an optimized character can take away from that immersion, I would say. For example, if you're a monster hunter, like John has had before, if you're a monster hunter and you just suck at all the nature checks and the investigation checks and all that stuff, then you're not going to feel very much like a monster hunter when it comes down to it. So optimizing your character and coming up with the right way to invest your ASIs, your feats, and all that stuff is going to be important for you in expressing your character. Another point is that D&D is a mechanical game. It is a storytelling game primarily, in my opinion. You come up with a lot of interesting scenarios and you figure out how your characters are going to operate around them. But there is a whole pillar of play that requires mechanical gameplay where you're rolling dice, you're adding numbers, and doing cool damage. So you need to keep in mind that min-max characters are going to shine in those areas, but if you're not min-max, then you're just going to kind of get beat up a lot. And that can take away, again, from the immersion, or your character might die. So that would kind of suck. Those are the 2 points that I wrote down, but I'm sure there's more we can talk about.
An initial thought in all of this is it's strange to think about the community and how players will like verbally punish other players for making choices that benefit them. It's a strange thing to say, like, oh, well, I wanna play a tiefling, and oh, they have a charisma bonus. Isn't that cool? How about I play a sorcerer? Because that'll help me out. Yay! And this also fits with my story, and I'll be a good spellcaster because I get a nice charisma bump. How dare you optimize? Like, why? It's a beneficial thing. Like, why do we have to get really mad about that? And it's not even necessarily that they're, min-maxing. It's, oh, look, these connect. Isn't that nice?
All right.
There's a lot there. And from the pros end, is another quick aside before I let John do his thing. We've talked a lot before on how if you build a grappler, you want your grappler to be effective at grappling. It doesn't make the character uninteresting to be bad at grappling or to be mediocre at grappling by min-maxing, or let's say optimizing in this way toward being a good grappler. You are fulfilling the story, at least the mechanical side. You're backing up with mechanics in the game the story you want to tell. So it's fulfilled in the game state and in the social state and the exploration state. It's all synergistically good because there's a through line to the story you want to tell, and you don't have this weird misalignment where I want to be a good grappler, but I chose to make myself a bad grappler, so it never matches and it's not satisfying to me.
So I've talked about this before.
Yeah.
But we're gonna bring it back for our viewers that might not have followed all 103 or however many prior episodes we've recorded, or is this is 103?
This is 103. Yep.
Okay. So, let's start with the cons. The first one is that it breaks the game balance. Now remember, we are talking about min-maxing in D&D 5th edition specifically, all right? This is no comment on 4th edition, no comment on 3rd edition, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Mechton, any other tabletop RPG that you might. This is strictly 5th edition. 5th edition was designed for optimizing in mind. They built the mechanics specifically, and they built the player suggestions in the player's handbooks to bring it back to expectations, with the expectation that you won't purposefully sabotage your character from a statistical perspective, which is really what you're doing. If you're building a wizard and you have intelligence be your lowest stat, like, you're not fulfilling the mechanics that the game was expecting you to do. So this whole argument that it somehow breaks the game balance, I don't think it carries any weight, especially since the designers have acknowledged that they expect players to basically have their racial and class scores line up. And the other thing is, with 5th edition's design, they intentionally did not add a lot of small choices, because small choices lead to small gaps in power that over time create large gaps of power, which is the Pathfinder problem, right? That because there are so many feats and so many chances to gain additional feats every other level, like, because of that, the optimized or min-maxed feat chain is very specific to what's going to be the best outcome, 5th edition doesn't have that. You don't have these small choice points. You have very large, clear choice points, which means that, if you're a min-maxer, you still have a choice of undesirable statistic, right? As Ian put it. So, and the other thing is, usually a character only needs to prioritize 2, at most 3 ability scores, and then the other 3, usually the other 3 kind of fall by the wayside. Now, that being said, in 5th edition's main game system, the 3 ability scores that it tends to value the most are Dexterity, Constitution, and Wisdom. Those are the 3 that you see as common saving throws. We talked about this before. Dexterity also influences your initiative and your armor class. Constitution is your hit points, right? So if you put a negative in your Constitution, don't be surprised that you get knocked out easily. And then Wisdom, Perception is the most common skill check of the game, whether it's a passive perception or an active perception. So when you're designing, let's say a Paladin, it's clear your 3 ability scores you're going to prioritize are Strength, Con, and Charisma, right? You're an upfront fighter. You want to actually hit stuff. Your spellcasting modifier is Charisma. Those are your 3 things. Where you decide to put your other ability scores is going to flavor that character. Not exactly optimized because, like we said, Dex and Wisdom are like the other 2. But if you have a -1 to Dex, you're not going to create a broken character that can't perform well. It's probably not the best thing in the world. But still, now you're creating some kind of that mechanical flaw will lead to a role-playing flaw, right? For Solomon, his 3 highest scores were the 3 common ones. It was Dex, Con, and Wisdom, right? He also had a decent intelligence, but he had terrible strength and charisma, which led to a lot of role-playing flaws. When it came to talking to people, he was terrible at it, because his charisma was a mechanical flaw. So the thing that people who criticize min-maxing often forget is that they're so focused on tearing down the maximize part, they forget about the minimize part. And the other thing is, this isn't accounting for team dynamic, right? Which I think Ian also brought up. But, you have a character that's a rogue. They've got awesome, let's say, Dex and intelligence, but they don't have awesome strength. You have a barbarian that has strength and con. They kind of make up for each other's weaknesses. That's what the game is supposed to be. Speaking about expectations. The thing about discouraging variety comes back to this, right? So, you can, let's say, Rogue is my favorite one to bring because Rogue really, the only stat you really need to be an effective Rogue is Dexterity, There's a rogue archetype for everything else. There's a rogue archetype for Dex and Intelligence. That's Arcane Trickster. Swashbuckler is Dex and Charisma, Scout Rogue or Inquisitive is Dex and Wisdom, So if you just want to be just a tough rogue, Dex and Con, there you go, So and those are all super different characters, I don't think that somehow, and really when it comes to min-maxing, we are specifically in 5th edition just talking about ability score distribution. That's it. And to bring it back to randomness versus fixed, really, as soon as you let your players roll for their stats, you can't even talk about min-maxing. Because you might have a player that has all high stats and a player that has all low, has nothing to do with the choices they've made to allocate those stats. It has everything to do with the luck of the dice, right? The other choice point you have would be skill proficiency distribution. Sometimes there are just some skills that are better than others. Really, Jeremy Crawford recently said, the amount of skills is what matters for a character's power, not what skills your character's proficient in. Yeah, having a high dex or a high perception or a high insight will probably help. But when it comes to everything else, that's super situational, And understanding, if you have characters that all took perception and no one took a medicine proficiency, now you're not optimized, You haven't optimized your party. Because that's what min-maxing really is a conversation about. It's making sure everybody has a very clear role. And as long as everybody is listening, then you won't have the outshining problem, right? The outshining thing is something that accidentally happened because I tried to pull a critical role where nobody should reveal their character beforehand and everybody brought a tank, So that, And that's where you got kind of that whole, some characters felt outshined. But if a character went in knowing they're a support caster and they know that somebody else has covered DPR and tank, you're not going to outshine anybody, especially if you do standard array, point buy, because now everybody has the same numbers to work with. Everybody can fairly distribute their stats. Everybody can make sure everybody else's weaknesses are covered. So you come up to a situation where your character's not good at it. Now that gives another player the chance to shine, Like, this is the system is designed for this. This isn't some concept of like, we're sneaking around the system. We're breaking 5th edition. The one thing 5th edition doesn't really have balanced well is multi-classing, as per Raw, Multi-classing is where you start to really see powerful combos that were not designed, that outshine kind of single classing, right? That's where a lot of this optimizing comes from. And I've also found it's not so broken, it takes away from the game's fun. Now, this whole it discourages role-playing thing, that's a player personality thing. That has nothing to do with whether or not your character is optimized or not optimized. I have seen all examples, right? I have played characters that are highly optimized and well-received from a role-playing story perspective. I have seen characters that are not optimized and not well received from a story perspective, Just because I play a gnome bard and the ability scores don't line up doesn't mean I automatically have an interesting character that's fun to play with, And just because I have an orc barbarian, right, with super optimized features and everything, doesn't mean that I don't have an interesting story to tell there, So, and I've also seen the others. I've seen, half-orc wizard. You wouldn't think they can tell an interesting story, even though it's not like super optimized or whatever. And I've also seen, there have been times where it's like I have a wood elf archer. All I'm thinking about are the numbers. Roleplay isn't even factored into this. So like there are certain builds that are more powerful, but really what are the choices that you're optimizing? Ability score distribution, which is based on your class, race and background choices. Those are the major character creation choices you're doing. There's not a lot there to optimize. And sure, in the progression, you can multi-class. Sometimes, a Sorlock will often outshine a Warlock, right? Just because they can quicken Eldritch Blast and double their DPR output. But we know that about the game. If we just have a conversation about it, it shouldn't be this big surprise and it shouldn't be this big, like, battle, Yeah. As for the pros that you mentioned, yeah, it's interesting to have a character be able to do what they're designed to do. But because they're designed to do that, you've also built in something that they're not designed to do. It's the min part of min-maxing. It's what humanizes them. You could have a super effective, damage-dealing rogue that sneaks attacks like a fireball, but they can't talk to people. So like there's some interesting story to explore there in that, well, why can't you talk to people? Can I help you learn how to talk to people? That whole thing, And it just, usually this is when this gets brought up, it's a very surface level comment that if you look at it with any sort of depth, you automatically see where the flaws are in the person's argument, So that is my latest rant on why min-maxing is just it's just a component of D&D. It's not good or bad. It doesn't automatically mean your character is awesome or your character is boring. I've played with players that purely make selections for mechanical reasons and do not follow through on the role play of their character, and their character is boring and doesn't really help the party, right? It doesn't create interesting dynamics. I've done my best, I have characters, my characters tend to be optimized. I'm not going to build a barbarian with negative con, but that doesn't automatically make them interesting, right? And it also doesn't, it doesn't help, it doesn't add to the party's dynamic. Just because I'm not doing my job doesn't imagine going to work, you go to work at Subway. There's a guy that refuses to make sandwiches. That doesn't make them interesting and worthy of exploit. It just makes them lazy, like it's what is the thought behind your character? And is that going to contribute to the immersion and the narrative that you're doing? That's the more interesting conversation. How are you contributing to the group story, not, blaming individual party members just because they kind of can read that, hey, +2 charisma, hey, sorcerer likes charisma, hey, let's match them up. That's, that's not automatically like, how dare you? Like, it just, I don't know.
A lot of this is a very divisive and almost sensationalist. I feel like they're as if we were looking at news articles, and it's just the catching headline of this divisive nature that min-maxing ruins D&D, blah, clickbait. And it's like, if anybody looks at this with any measure, I mean, you click on some of those and you read them and go, this is a very poorly written article that's not considering any of the other points that are present in the text at all. Oh, I clicked it. I guess I gave them ad revenue. A lot of these arguments they're just surface level. The moment you start going any deeper and actually have a conversation with the person, usually acquiesces. And there's a point where they go, well, yeah, oh, yeah, but yeah, okay. And it's like, we don't also take into that point that we're all humans and we all have different choices. We can make other choices. It's okay to make choices. And the fact that if I optimize my character, that doesn't also say I can never role play because I optimize my character. We're human beings. And if you have a person who optimizes and then doesn't RP, that doesn't mean that the optimization was the reason they didn't RP. It's them, and you can still optimize and be an excellent role player. The two do not pull away from each other. They're all parts of the game state, and they're all parts of the table. And you can have someone who doesn't optimize at all and is highly effective in role playing, or someone who doesn't optimize at all and makes distinctly poor decisions in the mechanical state and also doesn't role play at all. They're not related.
Yeah, and I think, all right, again, to come back to my first point, we are talking about 5th edition, right? We're talking about the edition we play right now that we always talk about. I can see how somebody that's had experiences with Pathfinder or 3rd edition, where there is a larger power gap between min-maxers and people who don't min-max, where all of a sudden, you can build what you think is a cool fighter who's meant to be a damage dealer in a tank, be completely outshone by somebody else who knew how to feat chain correctly, and is tripling your damage output and really outperforming you. The mechanics of that system also reward players for arguing based on what's written in the book, So this is where rules lawyers really came about because of 3rd edition, because 3rd edition tried to codify every single thing that could possibly happen in the game. What happens when a character grabs my left leg while I'm sinking versus my right leg while I'm sinking? What's my max damage bonus? Can I confirm my critical, What does it mean if my hair is red when I go to the gala versus pink, All these little decisions lead to large power gaps. And really people who I find tend to criticize min-maxing or tend to criticize optimizing, it's because they've had some kind of negative experience where, again, they were outshone because somebody else, instead of thinking of the story, thought only of the numbers with a system that encouraged it. This system expects it, kind of encourages it, but doesn't really harshly punish you for not. Yeah. Unless it's super obvious, if you're a wizard and your spellcasting modifier is intelligence and you put your 8 in intelligence, you're not going to do that well because the game told you you're not going to do that well. Again, 5th edition is archetypes, this isn't supposed to be rocket science, when you have a secondary ability, if you're a wizard and you have a high intelligence, high charisma, and you don't have a very good con or dex, you might get knocked around a little more in combat. You might die a little easier, but you can still pull that character off, especially if your DM is playing a game type that encourages that, like say a social interaction or a cloak and dagger game, Each different builds can be optimized based on the context of the kind of game you're playing, you know? So it's kind of like we talked about that with Whisper Bards. Whisper Bards in general aren't as good as other bards. There are some Cloak and Dagger games, though, where they're actually a more efficient option, you know?
Yeah.
So, and that's, 5th edition is designed with that in mind.
Yeah, no, this game is definitely really based on archetypes, and that actually, it also brings me to a final thought here, is when do we, what is the underlying thing? You were talking about how like people have experience with Pathfinder and 3rd edition, and how that may influence their ideas about min-maxing, at least on a surface level. What about when a player prioritizes a mechanical consequence over a storytelling consequence due to the min-maxing stuff? And also, how do these kinds of things interact? So if you choose to make a mechanical decision that is going to if you choose to make a mechanical decision in the hopes of creating a storytelling consequence, like what does that really say about this idea of how you feel about min-maxing and stuff? Intentionally creating a detriment for your character through the mechanics and the stats, or intentionally inhibiting your character during combat because it's what your character would do, that kind of thing. So it's just interesting to me because I think that might be like an underlying feeling about it, because you look at the numbers and you want the story to reflect the numbers you have on your character sheet. Therefore, every time in every single decision you make in combat should do the same.
Sounds like those people should play Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Well,
I mean, sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, it just this to put context. You're talking about like the character tackling my character, right?
Yeah, I was just.
And we've seen this in Grey Owls before as well. You know, where like one character goes to cast a spell and another player character counterspells it because there's some kind of story reason why they would, you know. Or, you know, what happened in this latest game, to give a little context, was, you know, my character, I don't even know if it's a secret. He's not being very secretive about it, but none of them listen to the podcast anyway. I'm playing a vampire character, right, in a Curse of Strahd game. And this vampire is very, very old and very, very weak relative to where his power level was. So, and he is super mad because, you know, so while he was asleep, Strahd became the big bad vampire in town. So the mechanical build is Sorlock at the moment. So, you know, we, as part of our starter adventure, and I think, Adam, when you played Curse of Strahd, you probably had a similar scenario where Father Donovich, who is a priest of the Morning Lord, his son was turned into a vampire, and he kept him in the basement. So we heard, like, help me, it hurts, I'm starving, that whole thing. So we went down into the basement, because why not? So, and then, you know, we see him, and he's like, scratching his face, like, I'm so hungry. Instead of talking to him, my character was a vampire who's arrogant and also doesn't like seeing other people get away with what he's good at. Before anyone else is allowed to do anything, he just shoots him. Bang, bang, with Eldritch Blast to the face, and deals him like 20 points of force damage to initiate combat before anybody else has the chance to act. That was a character decision, because that's what my character would do. He wouldn't try to talk to him, not based on that personality. So another character at the first round of combat used his action to tackle me, because that's what his character would do. So, and I told him in character, I'm just like, hey man, feel free to tackle me. That'll just make it easier for him to bite you. And then, lo and behold, that was the first thing the vampire spawn did, is he went over and bit him and started dealing necrotic damage.
Oh no.
So, and then that's when the comment came up, like, just because you're picking the optimized route doesn't mean it's interesting. And it's like, it also doesn't mean it's not interesting, you know? Because some could argue that was a flawed choice that I made by not doing it. But at the same time, that's part of the personality flaw of the character I'm deciding to role play.
I wonder if there's, you know, the question we need to be asking is, what is the kind of story that the person is trying to tell? If they're making, say, a wizard that has low intelligence, what is the story they're trying to tell? And some of it, we go, why did you do that? One, you won't be very effective, but there might be a specific thing they're going for. Like, why make a monk who has one arm and the other arm is bandaged up and broken all the time? so he fights with his feet. Why do that? Because there's a certain story I want to tell, and I want to see if that story is possible. That might just be it. It's like a challenge to themselves. Some players, I've seen that happen, where they make the worst possible version of the creature they're going on. They pick, like, and it's not that they picked the wrong race, but they picked a very non-optimized race for the class that they're going for, and then they put all the stats in like the wrong places for being an effective caster or an effective fighter or something, an effective rogue. And like, they're terrible at stealth. How funny would that be? What kind of story are they trying to tell? It's a strange thing, because they're putting mechanical detriments on things that you that you wouldn't expect them to, and the game, especially 5th edition, wouldn't expect you to. Whereas other games, Deadlands and Savage Worlds, that have, flaws, and you gain benefits to I took an extra detriment, so I get an extra feat or an extra bit of money at the start of the game. I get rewarded for making myself a little bit messed up. And then, like Call of Cthulhu, putting in all that time to make a starting place and then watch yourself become corrupted. Those are different kinds of stories that they want to tell. I wonder if, as I see that with different people, if it's just more of I made a cartoon and I want to see what happens. I made something purposefully ineffective to see if I can tell a certain kind of story. And then I'll see people make an ineffective character purposefully and then get angry that they're ineffective. And it's that third group that I go, well, yeah, you made an ineffective character. What did you think was going to happen? And it's interesting to then think about the player state. What sort of player is jumping into that? And is it worth then having the conversation, DM to player, of, hey, you gave yourself a negative in your intelligence. Intelligence is your casting stat. What sort of story are you trying to tell? Because you're not going to be mechanically as effective as had you done this. So I'm just curious what it is you're planning. What are you thinking? What is the story you want?
So, and this is, all right, this is my response to all of that, which is, you asked the perfect question, Adam. Why have you chosen this mechanical expression for the story you want to tell? The follow-up question being, is this the best mechanical way to tell this story? So what I'm hearing when you say I've purposefully built an ineffective character to see what would happen is, I want randomness to determine more than a pre-planning how my character's things will resolve, because there is an excitement to see what that randomness entails. Ultimately, that's what the numbers in 5th edition mean. It's, I have a modifier, so I have a greater chance at succeeding at these certain things I want my character to be good at versus not. So if I'm building a monk with a bandaged arm and Dex isn't my highest stat, and I go to kick something, well, now I just want more randomness to determine whether or not it's gonna succeed. Now the other thing you're doing, though, is you're just creating less of a probability, and this is going to be the thing that might make some people mad. When you create an ineffective character, you have now min-maxed, right? You've automatically done it. You've minimized the undesirable outcome, because the desirable outcome is to be effective. You're the undesirable outcome is to be ineffective. So so even though you haven't built what the game system expects, you just min-maxed again, because you made a decision to lower the undesirable outcome being that this thing works more often than it doesn't. And you've increased the desirable outcome, which is, I want to get more randomness. So you're always min-maxing. It's whether or not you admit it to yourself. That's the difference, right? And then the other thing is, there might be times, if you want to tell a specific story, that there's better mechanics than that to tell the story you want to tell. You want to play a really fast rogue that's great at acrobatics but terrible at stealth? Just decide to fail all your stealth rolls. So like when somebody goes like, roll a stealth check, just say, I choose to fail. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
If that's the story you want to tell the story. Don't try to like point outside of yourself or abdicate the responsibility of telling the story you want to tell to just because somebody else is telling the story they want to tell, you know? So, and that's the biggest thing is usually like when it comes up, like it's min-maxing, it's not interesting or whatever. It's like, why are you pointing outside of yourself if you're getting what you want out of it, which is you want an interesting character, you know?
That's an interesting point
like,
too, to recognize that I choose to fail.
Yeah.
And that's such a huge choice point that I think a lot of people feel, at least in the beginning, before they kind of level up their play, that they are locked into whatever the game's mechanics are, that I can't choose outside of that. The numbers must express what I want them to express. And then, I rolled well. That's not interesting. I rolled poorly. That's not interesting. What if you could just say, I choose to fail?
Yeah, and the only thing is it kind of, the other side usually doesn't work, which is I choose to succeed, you know?
Yeah, right, yeah.
But like how many times have we played a Grey Owls game and somebody's been like, I do an insight check on Solomon to see if he's lying. And I say, I choose to fail my deception check. I am not a deceptive character. You automatically understand that this is the truth from the player perspective and you succeeded on your insight check. I'm not competing with you, you know? So that's a lot of times, you know, how does that change? Like if you're opting into failing, that is an interesting story. But just because you're opting into failing, that doesn't make somebody else who's opting into succeeding, you know, less interesting, you know? And I think that's the key thing is why are we comparing ourselves? Why are we getting away from the idea that we're working together and letting everybody have their moment to shine and meaningfully contribute to tell a great story? Why are we getting stuck? Why have we spent an hour talking about like why I'm allowed to put charisma as my best stat for my sorcerer, you know?
Yeah,
and
right.
all of a sudden that hasn't created the worst character on the planet, you know?
Yeah, and I think to wrap that up, it's really just a matter of I just want to point out that I, as a DM, I neither discourage or encourage min-maxing. What my players bring to the table is like what they bring. I do, however, set certain limits, like standard array. It's important so that there's a sense of fairness. It's very important. But so what you said there about outshining other players and stuff, maybe that happened. Maybe a min-max character will be more effective in combat or something like that. But if you as the DM are finding that some of your players are taking spotlight time away from other players, either intentionally or just by nature of being able to improv really well and roleplay really well, and that just intimidates the other players, that's when you have a conversation with your player and say, hey, I would like to encourage my other players to roleplay some more. Perhaps we've done a lot of spotlighting your character and how you play and stuff. Perhaps your character could start facilitating the other party members to roleplay, and you could encourage them to come out of their shell a little bit. Because D&D is a very social role-playing game, and it can be hard for some people, especially those who have anxiety, to express themselves. So I just wanted to round off the thought with that. It's min-maxing is interesting because it's basically unavoidable, and just based on 5th edition's design. And I think it's a good conversation to have, and people have to acknowledge that a lot of the concerns about it are pretty surface level.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So the other, like, one last thing is a lot of these cons that the more I look at them, the more they're just so contradictory. So, for example, I want to create an ineffective character. You now can't complain that somebody else is outshining you because you chose to be outshone. Like that's a key thing, you know. It doesn't break the game balance, and if it breaks the party balance, there are things you can do to, as the dungeon master, you have ultimate control to rebalance. So, Ian, perfect example is, one of the characters in this game was going to try to go 6 levels of monk in order to get Shadow Step just for the teleportation ability, right? He wasn't actually going to fight anything. As a healer, he wanted to be able to teleport around and heal people and get into position. So, as a character, I created an optimized Warlock, which isn't very hard. You just take 2 levels of Warlock and 2 levels of Sword. It's not rocket science. This other character might have started really falling behind in terms of effectiveness. So Ian was just like, how about you don't take 6 levels of Monk? How about you take 2 levels of Monk and the rest Cleric? I'll give you a magic item that lets you do a lighter version of this ability. So you just get to teleport 30 feet as a bonus action in dim light or darkness. So like if there's like a concept like that, like in coming up into this next Grey Owls game, I've already messaged Adam and I've been like, I want my character to be able to have unarmored defense. I don't think it'll break anything, but I also don't want to start investing in other class levels that'll take away from my character's ability to focus on his main thing. Is this something he can learn or build to or progress towards? Not something I'm asking you just give me, but is this something that I can somehow earn outside of my leveling progression, whether it's an item or whether it's an ability, so that my character can perform based on the story I have in my head? You as the DM absolutely have the right to like just award extra features or award extra magic items if it seems like this player has outshined them. They because they've chosen things mechanically in order to outshine somebody. You can discourage that behavior by just giving extra stuff to the other players to balance out the scales a little bit, which hopefully will communicate to the min-maxing player that's only focused on their numbers. I don't care about your numbers. I care about telling interesting stories. And if you're only going to look at the numbers, I'm going to boost up everybody else's numbers. And then maybe you'll start thinking about the story. And if you start thinking about the story, I might reward you mechanically for that too. So everybody wins, So why, and that's my other thing is, why is it, like Adam said, why is this an either or? Why is this divisive? It's not mutually exclusive. You can have both and have a satisfying experience. So that's
a bunch of dinguses. This comes back to recognizing, we said before, like the DM is player too. So when I say this next part, let's assume that the DM is included in this. This is a cooperative experience, and you can be everybody's biggest fan. I don't know why this keeps coming up as a topic that we see in surface levels, where we are literally tearing apart other people based on their mechanical game choices in a game. And you can also, like at the table, if you feel like someone is let's not even say outshining, because it's not a competition. It doesn't have to be this comparative state. It's, hey, they're really doing well at that. I'm doing pretty well at that. Isn't that cool? How about we're both pretty okay at this thing? Or, hey, isn't that great that you talk really well? Cool. Why can't it be that you're someone else's biggest fan? When it's not your turn, you can be the other player's biggest fan. You can raise each other up instead of tearing each other down, and that's going to create a more holistic and wonderful experience, also just from a basic rapport at the table. When you start comparing the numbers outside, inside and outside the game state in a way to say, you're more effective than I am at this thing, and that's not fair, we forget that there's randomosity to all of this, and also, why? Just why? We could be spending more time telling an interesting story and playing together rather than arguing about why you chose a charisma character or why you chose a character with high intelligence to help out your wizard stat. How dare you?
I guess the outshining thing, to clarify, because I have been someone who's been outshined.
Yeah.
And I've also had players be outshined at my table. Usually it's a feeling where you're lacking contribution. So the outshining isn't you're doing better than me. The outshining is I'm not contributing in a meaningful way, you know? So like, for example, my first character, Gray, everyone else was getting extra attack. Everybody else was casting spells and doing all these big things. I couldn't even hit, So it was less like, oh, you're doing better than I am, and more like I haven't meaningfully contributed in the past 3 months of play.
Mm-hmm.
So like, why am I here if I don't have any impact,
Mm-hmm.
So it is something to consider. I do believe in just because, if something happens and you're not doing well, doesn't mean you can't recognize that other people are doing well. But a lot of times I find, like, let's go back to Monday campaign 2, where I had all tanks at my table. 4 out of the 6 players decided to play tanks. 2 of them are barbarian. 1 of them was cavalier fighter. One of the barbarians who wasn't used to playing a tank and she just wanted to experiment, she felt like she couldn't meaningfully contribute, because by the time her turn came around, everybody else had already done her job for her. So she couldn't contribute in that way. So I agree with you. There's no reason to tear down somebody else that you can't recognize the contribution they're making, but it is good to recognize your own feelings if you don't feel like you're meaningfully contribute, and bring that up in a conversation with the DM where it might be that, they give you a special thing that allows you to express that role uniquely so that you're still contributing to the dynamic.
When you feel ineffective, you have a choice of how you reconcile that you can speak to the DM, that you can also, talk outside of the game with your other players. You can have a conversation as a group, or you can go to Facebook and complain. And I feel like there's a lot of the things that I see on the forum posts and the various groups that I'm a part of. The main solution that comes from, this is happening and I'm less effective and then all this and I don't like it and this is stupid and I'm optimized and I don't want to have to do this thing. And then the last few comments usually resolve with, hey, have you spoken to your DM? Hey, have you talked about this with anyone? No, they won't listen to me. And then the DM comes on and goes, I'm listening. We can figure something out. Oh, okay. And it's so much of this could have been dealt with if the group felt, welcoming enough to just talk about it. In the same vein, this is a cooperative experience.
And you just brought it up as an or, but sometimes I do think that both of those are an and.
I could see that. Yeah,
imagine they tried to go to their DM and their DM was like, nope, these are the choices you've made. You can't rebuild your character.
Right.
Nope, yeah. You've bought your Triceratops. Now you have to feel the consequences of it. No, you can't rebuild. You can't respec. That's going to start to take trust away from the relationship.
Yeah.
And as the DM, they might not even see it like that, but now they have to work to kind of rebuild that trust again. Do you know what I mean? So there are ways that you're absolutely right. Ultimately, this comes down to a conversation between the player and the DM, because the DM is the adjudicator. The DM is going to be the direct influencer in what their experience is if they're feeling ineffective. And remember, ineffective is a trend or a pattern based on the mechanical limitations of the character. If you're just not rolling well, that's not on the DM, to come fix your problems, It doesn't matter if you have a plus 11 to your attack roll. If you haven't rolled above a 5 all night, that's just luck of the dice. That's just randomness sometimes, which is why it's good to be able to sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, kind of determine what's going to be fixed, what's going to be random, because there have been plenty of times where it's no, your character can reasonably smack that person on the back of the head. You just do it. You, as the DM, I rule, you automatically succeed. You take out the randomness because the randomness isn't going to contribute to the game experience. So there are times where it's if your character is feeling ineffective, it might be because you're rolling bad because the DM is calling for rolls that are unnecessary. There are times though where a roll is necessary and you're just rolling bad. That's not on them, Yeah. But sometimes it can be where the DM or the group, they just don't have that trust. If they're going to Facebook, it means they don't have that trust, and it might not be the DM's fault. Again, we bring this back. It might be because that player has had prior experiences at another table that has colored their perception of what D&D means and what your DM relationship means, right? So if you ever have a player and you're you don't need to rules lawyer, it's because at another table, the DM DM'd in a way that encouraged them to rules lawyer. It encouraged that behavior to the point that now at this table, you have to almost work to override that. So a lot of times, again, we bring it back to that why question that you mentioned earlier, Adam. If they're fleeing to Facebook, what has incentivized them to do that? What has incentivized them to, or encourage them to seek that as their solution instead of just talking to the DM and then not blame them because of it? Because ultimately, they've experienced a system that has encouraged them to do that. How can we create a system that encourages them to talk to us, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It all comes down to making a making a good rest model at your table. And that's going to create rewarding and dynamic experiences where you can try some crazy things. If your players all trust you and you can trust them and you're creating a cool experience, then you're going to be able to do a lot more. That's kind of our whole thing. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. You can find us on YouTube over at DM Shower Thoughts. You can also find the GM's Corner over at AdamusDrakeProductions.com, where you have John's study hall, sometimes notes from The Apprentice, and then all of my weird, wacky things. And also, this podcast comes up on Podbean every Friday at noon, also on iTunes and also on Spotify. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.
Games are fun to play. Whether it's chess, Mario Kart, or Dungeons & Dragons, we've all sat down to play a game with our friends before. But what is it that keeps us coming back to our favorites? How do developers craft the experiences that keep us this engaged? I'm Sully, host of the podcast Fun But Why. Join us as we talk to game industry professionals and break down the levels, mechanics, and design of their favorite gaming experiences. Fun But Why releases new episodes every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.